It was March of 1994, Johannesburg, South Africa. I had been there several times before, but this time was different. You see, this time was a month before Nelson Mandela would be elected president of South Africa. This time was different because everyone was afraid. No African country had ever transitioned to democracy without lots of bloodshed, violence, and death. I could feel the tension everywhere. But the day that I was to present, I was focused on the workshop. I had been invited to deliver a full-day leadership development program. I hadn't made a full commitment to diversity and inclusion just yet. I didn't really like what I had seen other people do back then. It was too much blame and shame. So I was still delivering many different types of workshops and keynotes. I was excited about being there because these would be 60 automotive executives. They would all be white because no black people had risen to the level of executives yet, and they would most likely all be men. My meeting planner had told me that there wouldn't likely be any women because there weren't any women at high levels either. So I was excited about it because I used to work for General Motors many years ago and thought, well, this will be pretty normal. I'm totally focused on what was going to be happening that day. Well, as I was setting up, in walks the first participant. It was a woman. I was so excited. I went right over to her and I extended my hand and I said, "Hi, my name is Lenora." Not only did she not shake my hand, she wouldn't even give me eye contact. She picked up her name badge, walked over to the seat farthest away from me as she could get, but I did notice her name was Annie. Now I'm going to push pause right now, but I promise you I'll tell you the rest of the story about Annie a little bit later. So let's jump right into the content. There's an elephant in the room, and the elephant is this question. What makes it hard, scary, uncomfortable about talking about diversity, inclusion, racism, bias, any of those type of topics? Well, as you can imagine, I've asked many groups that question. And what I've discovered is that I tend to get 5 answers. I don't know what to say. I might say the wrong thing. I might hurt somebody's feelings. It doesn't apply to me. Those are the kind of answers I get. I wonder what you're thinking right now because I'm going to address them. There's a reason why we're uncomfortable about talking about sensitive topics. You see, all of us as human beings want to belong. I bet you took Psych 101 in high school or college and you learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to try to remember them. But what he said way back in the 40s was that our most primary need as human beings is food and water. That makes sense, right? You got to have food and water to survive. However, because now we have science relative to our brain, the physical way our brain operates, as well as our mind, so we can kind of combine the two, neuroscience of bias, we now know that belonging is critically important. In fact, several scientists and researchers say belonging is the most important thing to human beings. So let's think about the question I just asked you. Why it's uncomfortable talking about these sensitive topics, and your response being, I'm afraid I might offend, or I don't know the right thing to say. Well, if our basic need is to belong, then we don't want to say or do something that's going to cause us not to belong. That's going to cause us to disconnect or to disconnect the other person. So it's a primary motivation. Now that's a good thing, except the problem is, since we're so uncomfortable talking about these topics, what we tend to do is surround ourselves with people just like ourselves. So if I'm a baby boomer, and baby boomers hang out with baby boomers, millennials hang out with millennials, Gen Xers and Gen Zs, the same thing. What happens though when we're in those homogeneous groups is that sometimes we start complaining about people not in those groups. In other words, we talk about the other, those folks that are not part of who we are. And what makes it worse is we tend to talk in generalities. Now, I know everybody doesn't do that, but go along with me. We do tend to talk in generalities. And what's worse is that nobody intercedes to stop that kind of conversation. What I mean, for instance, is baby boomers will say, oh, those millennials, they just are so entitled. And the millennials will say, you know, I got to teach the baby boomers how to turn on a computer, right? Now, of course, that doesn't mean everybody is that way, but when we make those kind of generalized comments, it goes into our brain. And it stays there until we need to make a decision about people in that particular group. Now, on the screen, of course, you see many different categories of how we end up being the us and them syndrome. And there are many more. One of the things that you can do right away is when you hear people making these very generalized statements is be willing to disrupt the biased comments. And what I mean by disrupt is simply ask a question. Help me know why you think that. Gee, that's not my experience, because sometimes just asking the question will cause people to think and help them get out of their emotional thinking, which is where that comes from, and get more into their cognitive thinking. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Well, because belonging is so important, every time I see this slide, it makes me sad, because here's these two little babies and they probably can't even walk yet, and they already have a device. But I call this imitation belonging, because it's not real. Although right now we're socially isolating, which to me is an oxymoron, socially isolating, but nevertheless, while we're socially isolating, we're not really connecting in the fullest sense of the word of belonging. Being on our devices and going to Facebook or other social media where we may have 4,000 friends, they're not really our friends. And human beings need more than that. So why is this important? Because in the workplace, what all of us are trying to do is to connect with other people. And sometimes, though, our biases get in the way, and we don't even realize that it's happening. Well, at the University of Michigan's medical school, in their research, they discovered that every time we feel isolated or separated or excluded, our brain equates it to physical pain. Physical pain. It doesn't make the difference between somebody saying something to us and somebody actually hitting us. For some folks, underrepresented groups, they go through this several times a day. So they may not feel as included as you would like them to be. So what can we do about that? What we could do as leaders in whatever organization we're in, at whatever level, what we can do as leaders is to break that culture of silence. Be willing to lean into the discomfort. Ask the questions. Have conversations. Now, I'm going to give you some specific pointers on how to do that in just a little while, but we have to break that culture of silence. So I mentioned bias a moment ago, and you're hearing a lot about bias these days. Unfortunately, the term is often applied to many things instead of just what it really represents. Bias, essentially, is a thought you have in your head. It's just a thought until you take action on it. So bias is normal, because every human being has bias. So if all of us have bias, then it's not those people, you know, the ones we were talking about a moment ago. It's not just certain people that have bias. We all have bias. The problem, though, is we tend to think of bias as a bad thing, simply because we only hear about those negative thoughts that turn into negative action that cause racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. But bias really is just a way of associating, a particular way of liking something versus another. So for example, as you're watching this video, you can tell that I have on a black top underneath this shirt. I tend to wear a black top all the time. I tend to wear black pants, because when I'm presenting, I never know when I might drop something and need to pick it up. It's better to have on pants. And if I wear a black top, then the two match, and all I have to do is think about what color I'm going to wear on top of it and pick out some jewelry. That makes it easy for me. So when I'm packing to travel, for instance, I just go to the black part of my closet. Well, black for me is a bias. It's a bias that works for me. All of you have those types of biases as well. So bias is normal. So let's look at how it works in the brain. The neuroscience of bias, and I'm going to use two terms, fast brain, slow brain, that come from Daniel Kahneman's work. He won a Nobel Prize in this area, so I figured he'd be a good guy to talk about here. Well, we have several parts of our brain that enable us to go to those biases really quickly. So one part is the anterior cingulate cortex. Don't worry, don't even have to think about remembering that term. Just think of it this way. Each of us has a database in the cloud, our own personal database in the cloud. It has everything that has ever happened to us from the day we were born. And some people would even say even before that, if your mother, when she was carrying you, played classical music, for instance, or other things that people say can help us be really smart once we're born. But the point is, everything that's ever happened to you is already in your brain. Now, of course, you're not thinking about it all at the same time because it would be impossible. So when you think of your database in the cloud, it's just like your computer and the database that you have in the cloud there. You only go to the files you need when you need them. So they're just kind of hanging out there. And then we have two amygdala. Now, the amygdala are connected to our limbic system, which is our nervous system. The amygdala's job is to keep us alive, essentially. So every time something happens, especially if there's some stimulus, something that's happening with you and a person you don't know very well, the amygdala shoots right up to your database in the cloud to see if there's anything there that is similar to what's happening right now. Now, it's looking for anything. So for instance, if you don't interact with Black people very often, or you don't really work with that many women in the workplace, and now something happens, it goes up to that database in the cloud to grab whatever is there. Now, the information that's there could be from a movie, could be from the media, could be something your grandmother told you a long time ago. So it might have made sense at that time, but maybe it doesn't make sense right now. And that's where we get in trouble. Because when we don't interact with people different than us on a regular basis, the only thing we can rely on is the information that we kind of have gathered from all types of places without even questioning it. And it will cause you to react in a certain way. So when I said the amygdala is trying to keep you alive, I'm sure you've heard the term fight, flight, or freeze. That comes from that dynamic of the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex. It's trying to figure out, should you freeze? Should you run? And it's telling you very fast. That's the challenge. Our biases are reactions that are trying to keep us alive, but sometimes they give us inaccurate information. Now, what we want to do is move to the other part of our brain where our prefrontal neocortex is. That's the part of our brain where we slow down our thinking, where our cognitive thoughts are. Here's the catch. The prefrontal neocortex is not fully developed until we're about 26. So just think about it. How many dumb decisions did you make before you were 26? Now, don't go telling your teenagers that that's the reason they do dumb things. Don't give them an excuse. But here's how it comes together. So you have that fast brain, as Daniel Kahneman calls it, the emotions, your old messages, the biases, all of those things living there. And they're triggered by emotional stimulus. So it's very fast. You can even feel it physically. You know, when you encounter somebody different than you, then maybe your hands get a little sweaty, or you kind of lift your shoulders because you're tensing up. All of those things are reactions to this new stimulus. What you want to do is go to your slow brain, which is where your cognitive thinking is, where you can make right and wrong decisions in the moment, not just based on old data. It's also where your morality is. What is the right or wrong thing to do?